Well, today we're going to be jumping into Romans chapter 2, verses 25 through 29. We invite you to grab any translation of the Bible that you have close at hand so that you can follow along. It's important to not only listen to the Word, but to read the Word and combine the two senses together. That's how God's Word can get deeper and penetrate deeper into our spirit and our lives. And so whatever translation you happen to use, that's fine. I'm going to be reading from the NIV. But you can use any translation that you would like. The words might be a little bit different, but the ideas will be the same. Before we jump into this passage for this week, we've got to do some review of where we have been to highlight some things. First thing we're going to take a look at is that having the knowledge of God's law isn't enough. This is something that Paul has been establishing in chapter 2. This understanding of God's law not being enough. That there's something more that we need as opposed to just being law keepers. And that's been very important, especially talking to the Jewish Christians in the church in Rome. This is important for the Gentile Christians in the church in Rome too, but also it's mainly focused at the Jewish Christians that don't hold on to the law thinking that just because you have the law, you're in God's good graces. Just because you have the law, you have this special exception or this special relationship. That's very important for Paul to get through to the church in Rome. Next thing we're going to see is that one must obey the law perfectly, because this is where the catch comes in with the law. The law is good if you can keep all of it. If you are able to perfectly keep every aspect of the law, then you will be good. The trick is, or the catch is that no human being has ever been, will ever be able to keep the law perfectly. All of us fall short of the mark. In fact, we've talked about the understanding that the law was given by God not to punish those who break it, but to convince each and every single one of us, to show every single one of us that we can't keep it on our own, so that as humanity, as creations of God, we would turn to God and say, I can't do this. We would throw up our hands and surrender. And so this law is no good unless it can be kept perfectly. It is good only to bring us to that place where we surrender, to bring us to that place where we admit and acknowledge that we cannot keep the law. And also, too, we have to ask this question as we go into these verses, and that is a Jewish Christian question of what about circumcision? Isn't that enough? Now, again, the practice of circumcision goes all the way back to Abraham and Abraham's descendants. For all of the male descendants were circumcised as a mark to set them apart from other people, to show them as God's chosen people. And so circumcision has come down through the generations as a symbol of a special connection with God, a symbol of being a part of the family of Abraham. Now, of course, in 2021, circumcision has become more of a medical procedure as opposed to a spiritual procedure. And so there are many people who are not descendants of Abraham who are circumcised in this world. And so the circumcision has a little bit of a different flavor. But if we go back to the time of Paul, we'll understand that the concept or the practice of circumcision was specifically carried out on the male children of the descendants of Abraham to set them aside. So circumcision was a sign, a physical sign of a spiritual connection. And so the Jewish Christians in Rome, of course, would have the question, okay, now we can't keep the law perfectly. Okay, we got that, Paul. You've beat us over the head with that. Well, what about circumcision? Circumcision is a physical mark that I am separated. I am different. And so this is something that he's going to have to wrestle with the Jewish Christians in the church in Rome. This understanding that the belief that circumcision is enough. But is it enough? And that's one of the questions that Paul's going to have to deal with as we take a look at Romans chapter 2, verses 25 through 29. So let's pick up our translations and let's go ahead and we'll read down through all the verses, and then we'll come back and we'll go one verse at a time. So let's listen to the word of the Lord. Circumcision has value if you observe the law, but if you break the law, you have become as though you had not been circumcised. So then, if those who are not circumcised keep the law's requirements, will they not be regarded as though they were circumcised? The one who is not circumcised physically and yet obeys the law will condemn you who, even though you have the written code and circumcision, are a lawbreaker. A person is not a Jew who is one only outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, And circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not by the written code. Such a person's praise is not from other people, but from God. Thanks be to God for the reading of this word. So we're going to go back to the top. We're going to take a look at verse 25. Verse 25 says, circumcision has value if you observe the law, but if you break the law, you have become as though you had not been circumcised. So we take a look at this concept that circumcision does matter if. And what's the if? If you obey the law. Again, listen to Paul's words. Circumcision has value if you observe the law. But if you break the law, you have become as though you had not been circumcised. Oh, and by the way, who breaks the law? Right, all of us break the law. No one can keep the law. No one can keep every aspect of the law. Yeah, you might get good at one area. You might be able to overcome something in one area and keep the law perfectly, but then you're going to fall short in another area. And so circumcision matters if you're able to keep the entire law, if you're able to obey the law. So this is the problem that he's presenting. This is the answer to the question, well, what about circumcision? I'm circumcised, so that means I have a special relationship with God. I have a physical sign of the special relationship with God. And Paul is going to be taking those people by the hand and leading them down this pathway to this understanding that circumcision only matters if you're able to keep the law. Oh, and by the way, you're unable to keep the law. Nobody can keep the law. The next thing we look at in this verse is that religious rituals cannot overcome the stain of sin. Again, circumcision is a religious ritual. Circumcision was a specific thing that was done in a specific time to a specific group of people, because it helped to separate them off from other people. It was a physical sign that could be passed down from generation to generation that connected the descendants of Abraham to each other. Now, by the time Paul is speaking, the descendants of Abraham are truly outnumbering the sand on the shore and the stars in the sky, because there are descendants of Abraham all over the place. And so at this point, circumcision is no longer anything but a religious ritual. It's still being practiced, is still practiced today. But circumcision is nothing but a religious ritual. Circumcision itself, any religious ritual, and for the Gentile Christians in the audience, you can take this to baptism, you can take this to communion, you can take this to any other religious ritual that you can think of. And no religious ritual can overcome the stain of sin. And so circumcision cannot overcome the stain of sin. It's just merely a physical mark to separate you off as descendants of Abraham. And that physical mark, even today now, is not even reserved just for the descendants of Abraham. There are many countries that practice circumcision for their male children because of health reasons. And so this religious ritual cannot save and will never be able to save. It cannot overcome the stain of sin. And it's important for us to remember that. The religious rituals that we practice in our life are very important, but they cannot overcome the stain of sin. There's only one thing that can overcome the stain of sin, and that is the blood of Jesus. That is faith and salvation through Jesus Christ. That's the only thing in the world that can overcome the stain of sin, that can wash you white as snow. No religious ritual can do that. Now, again, religious rituals are important. Is Paul saying, or am I saying, that circumcision as a religious practice is not good? No, I'm not saying that at all. But just don't believe that that religious ritual, that religious practice is going to save you, because it can't. And that's what Paul is saying. Circumcision has value if you observe the law. But if you break the law, you have become as though you had not been circumcised. So the law, breaking it or keeping it, is the important thing. And by the way, again, reminder, none of us can keep the law. So let's go ahead and take a look at verse 26. So then, because of what we read in verse 25, so then, if those who are not circumcised keep the law's requirements, will they not be regarded as though they were circumcised? So he's asking this rhetorical question. Basically what he's asking, he's saying, okay, so if you're saying that circumcision's value is based on obeying the law, then does that mean that someone who is not circumcised and obeys the law is in good graces, is okay? Whereas someone who is circumcised but disobeys the law is not okay. He's asking this clarifying question. Paul's asking this question. It's rhetorical in a sense, because he's not there to physically get an answer, but he's asking the question so that the audience thinks. He's asking the question so that we think about this concept. So if you're saying that circumcision only matters if it is joined together with obeying the law, and if you have circumcision and you don't obey the law, then it's like you haven't been circumcised anyways, then is the reverse true? Meaning, if you weren't circumcised and you obeyed the law, would you be okay? Would you be in God's good graces? And so it comes to that place that everything comes down to keeping the law. Again, he's pushing us into that corner. He's pushing the Jewish Christians in Rome into this corner. He's pushing us into this corner, that it all comes down to the law. He's lifting the law up, saying it's all about the law. It's all about keeping the law. It's about being obedient to the law. The law is what really matters, not the religious rituals, not your bloodline, not anything else. It's all about keeping the law. Oh, and by the way, you can't keep the law. And he's just driving this point home over and over and over again because it's so important for the church in Rome. It's so important for you and me to understand this concept, that we cannot do this on our own. We cannot be good enough to warrant salvation. We cannot be good enough to save ourselves. And this is an important message. This is an important lesson. This is the lesson that God was trying to teach the descendants of Abraham through the giving of the law. And that's what God is trying to teach us by studying the book of Romans. That everything comes down to keeping the law. Oh, and by the way, you can't keep the law. And so this is the point that he's going to hit over and over again until we understand that, so it serves as the foundation for where he's going to go in the rest of this letter. So let's take a look now at verse 27. Verse 27, the one who is not circumcised physically and yet obeys the law will condemn you who, even though you have the written code and circumcision, are a lawbreaker. And this is important what he's beginning to say here, because now he's bringing some condemnation into the situation. It's not just a recognition anymore. It's now condemnation. When we take a look at this verse, we see that circumcision is of no use to the Jewish lawbreaker. So if you are a Jewish person, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the nation of Israel, and you are circumcised and you break the law, you're just as good or just as bad. You're on the same level with any other person in the whole wide world that doesn't keep the law. The circumcision is not going to be the thing that saves you. But on the other hand, uncircumcision is no hindrance to the Gentile lawbreaker. So if you are someone who is not circumcised, if you are someone, again, talking about Paul's day in the church in Rome, and he's talking to this community, he's saying, if you're listening to this letter, if you're reading this letter and you're not circumcised, this is not a hindrance, as long as you're a law keeper. A law keeper. So you have this argument being carried out that's saying circumcision with breaking the law means death, means separation from God. Uncircumcision, keeping the law, means connection with God. He's setting all that up and he's making that very clear. But again, underneath the undercurrent of all of this is that still small voice, and that says, no one can keep the law. No one is able to do this. But it's important for him to establish this argument because in a worldly terms, in human terms, this is the direction the Jewish Christians would be going. Well, I've got circumcision. I've got the physical mark of a descendant of Abraham. I've got the physical mark of being one of God's chosen ones. Doesn't that give me a leg up? Doesn't that give me an advantage? And what he's saying is, no, it doesn't give you an advantage because it's all about the law. Oh, and by the way, no one can keep the law. The Gentile lawkeeper will condemn the Jewish lawbreaker. And so someone who is uncircumcised but yet keeps the law will condemn the Jewish circumcised person who doesn't keep the law. Now, when we say condemn, it's not that they're having some kind of trial and they're condemning them to death, but their very position, their very presence, their very being will be a condemnation because of the fact that they're able to achieve something, they're able to do something that the circumcised Jewish person is not able to do. But again, what is the still small voice that's underneath this whole thing? No one can keep the law. So Paul is making this argument here about, yes, an uncircumcised Gentile who keeps the law is in better standing with God than a circumcised Jew who doesn't keep the law. But underpinning this whole thing, that still small voice underneath everything is, oh, by the way, no one can keep the law. So really this is a moot conversation. What he's helping them to do is to jettison the religious ritual, to jettison this concept of circumcision having a benefit for them, because Paul wants them not to focus on the religious ritual. Even though religious rituals are good, he wants them and us to focus on the relationship with Jesus. He wants us to focus on the salvation that is ours through Jesus Christ. And so this is what he is establishing here in verse 27. The Gentile law keeper will condemn the Jewish lawbreaker. Again, not in a court of law, they won't punish them to death or anything, but their very being, their very presence will be a condemnation, because they are able to experience something, they're able to achieve something that the Jewish people can't achieve. But doesn't matter, because there's no such thing as a Gentile law keeper. Yeah, there could be a Gentile person that does better at the law than maybe a Jewish person does, but even the Gentile law keeper still falls short of the mark, because they can't keep the whole law, because that is the still small voice that's underneath this whole passage. No one can keep the law. Let's take a look at verse 28. So in verse 28, a person is not a Jew who is one only outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. And so what we're seeing here is what Paul is beginning to say is this understanding of, even by this time in the church in Rome, Paul is highlighting or shining a light on the fact that there are people who claim to be Jewish by nationality, not Jewish by faith or practice. And we see this even today. We run into people, we meet people that will claim to be Jewish, but they don't practice Judaism. They don't really, they aren't a practicing Jew. They're not keeping the law. They're not celebrating the feasts. They're not doing things like that. They don't go to synagogue. They don't go to the temple. They don't do things like that. But yet they will still claim to be Jewish, because Jewishness, even in Paul's day, is starting to become a nationality as opposed to a faith religion. And so this is what he's saying in this passage. Listen to that passage again with that as the foundation. A person is not a Jew who is only one outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. So you can claim to be a Jew, you can have circumcision, but that doesn't mean that you're a Jew, because that's just outward. That's just what you claim with your lips. That's just what your body reveals. This is not the sole arbiter of what it means to be Jewish. And so we're going to take a look in this verse of what it means to be Jewish. Jewishness doesn't matter concerning God's wrath. When it comes to understanding God's wrath, when it comes to understanding the areas in our lives in which we fall short of the mark, or we're separated from God, Jewish or Gentile doesn't matter. Because again, in God's eyes, a sin is a sin is a sin. Doesn't matter what the sin is. You and I as human beings, our culture in the world will make this hierarchy of this sin is worse than this sin. But God doesn't have that hierarchy. For God, anything that separates you from Him is bad. So a little sin in our mind is the same size of a sin in God's mind. A little sin in our minds doesn't mean it's a little sin for God. God's not up in heaven and say, well, that's just a little sin. No, it's separation. If I physically get up and leave, it doesn't matter what the reason is that I left, I'm gone. And so that's what God is, that's how God is seeing sin. And we need to understand this, is that whatever we do in our life that separates us from God, we are separated from God. So what that thing isn't as important as the result of it. So from God's perspective, a sin is a sin is a sin. Anything that causes you to be separated from God is bad. And so Jewishness does not matter concerning God's wrath, because a Jew who breaks the law and a Gentile who breaks the law are on the same footing. They're on the same ground. They all suffer God's wrath. They all fall in that place. And remember, we've talked about God's wrath in the past, and just in case you forget, God's wrath isn't God up in heaven shooting down lightning bolts to strike you dead. God's wrath is merely you being out of God's presence. So there's no connection. Again, sin is anything that separates you from God. So God's wrath is just the experience of God's non-presence. It's basically living outside of the realm of God, living outside of the power of God, living outside of the blessing of God. That's when we experience God's wrath. It isn't God physically doing something, it's us doing something that causes us not to benefit from that relationship. And so Jew or Gentile doesn't matter. A sin is a sin. Breaking the law is breaking the law, regardless of what your background is, regardless of what your bloodline is, regardless of what denomination you're a part of, regardless of what you can claim as your history. A sin is a sin. And all sin, regardless of we classify it as little sin or big sin, God sees it as separation. And that's the same thing. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the sin is. And so it's important for us to understand in this passage that Jewishness doesn't matter concerning God's wrath. And so keeping the law is the goal. But yet again, what's that still small voice underneath this whole passage? We can't keep the law. No one can keep the law. Circumcision without obedience is meaningless. Circumcision without obedience is meaningless. Now, again, I'm not talking about 2021 and the medical history and the medical proof for the fact that circumcision is healthier for boys than uncircumcision. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a spiritual, religious aspect of circumcision that was practiced in the family of Abraham that was used to be something that would mark them off as different so that they could be seen or understood as marked as to children of God. So that kind of circumcision, not the medical circumcision, but that kind of circumcision without obedience is meaningless. It's meaningless because a circumcised person who doesn't keep the law is in the same boat as an uncircumcised person who doesn't keep the law. But a circumcised person who keeps the law is in the exact same boat as an uncircumcised person who keeps the law. Oh, and by the way, what's the still small voice underneath everything? No one can keep the law. So again, we have to always remember that. Circumcision without obedience is meaningless. Religious practices cannot save anyone. And this is important not just for Jews, but for Gentiles too. Because we, as followers of Jesus in 2021, we have a tendency to lean towards our religious practices. And those are the things that save us. We say that a certain style of worship, a certain translation of the Bible, a certain type of music, a certain length of worship, a certain theology on communion, whatever the case may be, is the thing that saves us. When that's not true. Those are just all religious practices. That yes, we can have differences of opinions about worship style, differences of opinions about worship music, differences of opinions about how many times you celebrate communion or when you celebrate communion or what do you focus on when you celebrate communion. But all of those things do not save us. Again, as we've said so many times before, we can be wrong about everything and right about Jesus, and we will be right. Conversely, we can be right about everything and wrong about Jesus, and we will be wrong. And so it's important for us to understand that religious practices cannot save anyone. Religious practices are good. The way that you worship is good. The translation of the Bible that you choose to read from is good. The way that you celebrate communion or your understanding of baptism, that's all good. And do that and claim it and understand why you worship in that way or why you read that translation or why you have that understanding of baptism and be that person. But understand that none of that saves you, just like circumcision doesn't save you, because it's not about religious practices. It's about a relationship. And again, the law was always meant to push us towards that relationship. The law was not given so that we could dole out punishments for everyone who breaks it. The law was given so that as humanity we could realize that we can't be good enough, that we can't keep the law. Thus we turn, we throw up our hands, and we surrender to God saying, I need your help. And that's when God introduced Jesus to the mix. That's when God gave us Jesus and said, there you go. He is going to be your salvation. He's going to be the one that's going to pay the price. His blood is going to be shed for all. His gift of resurrection, his gift of eternal life is going to be given to all people. Not a religious practice. No religious practice can save us. No religious practice is able to do that, regardless of what you've been taught, regardless of what you have learned in your traditions. No religious practice can save us. We can only be saved by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. And of course, Paul will get into that, especially in chapter 3. Let's take a look at verse 29. And verse 29 goes like this. No, now remember this is a person is not a Jew who is one only inwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. Verse 28 and now verse 29. No, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not by the written code. Such a person's praise is not from other people, but from God. And so we start off with this last statement in verse 29 that says, such a person's praise is not from other people, but from God. And again, circumcision is an outward it's an outward practice. It's something that if you would see a Jewish and a non-Jewish man in the day of Paul and they were naked, you would know which one was Jewish and which one was not, because they would be circumcised or they wouldn't be circumcised. So this is an outward sign. You wouldn't have to speak a word. You wouldn't have to even be wearing a shred of clothing. You could just tell. And that's an outward sign. And so what he's saying here at the end, such a person's praise is not from other people, but from God. The importance is not for other people to know your Jewishness, not from other people to know your faith, but for God to know your Jewishness, for God to know your faith. That's the relationship that's important, not the relationship with other people. Remember, circumcision was given to Abraham and his descendants so that they would be set apart from all of the other people who were around at that time. Now, that outward appearance, because of Jesus, is not significant. The inward appearance is, and that's what Paul is talking about in this verse. So what is required to be truly Jewish? And that's the question that we kind of lead to. Again, if you were a Jewish Christian in the church in Rome and you were listening to these words, you were reading these words, you're asking this question, okay, so if circumcision's not the thing, then what is required to be truly Jewish? And that's the question that Paul gives. Now, put that question in your mind and listen to the verse again. No, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not by the written code. And so what is required to be truly Jewish? True circumcision is about the heart. It's not about the physical body. True circumcision is about the heart. And so it's about the heart. It's about the understanding of who you are, not what you do, not your practices, not your rituals, but who you are. Now, having said that, we have to acknowledge that who we are will always be reflected in what we do. But what we do will never transform who we are. We see that throughout history. You can change your behaviors, you can adjust your attitudes, you can adjust your behaviors, you can practice behavior modification all you want, but it's never going to change who you are. But you reverse that, and if you allow yourself, your inward self, your heart, your being to be transformed, it will 100% always affect your actions. It will always affect what you do. Now, what you do will never transform your heart, but transforming your heart will always affect what you do. And so it's important for us to understand that what Paul is saying to the church in Rome, what Paul is saying to the Jewish Christians in Rome, what Paul is saying to you and I today is that this concept of circumcision, this marking off as the children of God, is about the heart. It's not about the physical body. You and I have been chosen by God. You and I have been created by God. You and I are loved by God, not because of our physical bodies, but because of our heart. He is working on that heart. He's working from the inside out. Again, it's that understanding of the revelation of God throughout the history. If you look back in history, you go to the beginning of the Bible, you'll see there's God in the garden. He's walking with Adam and Eve, and then Adam and Eve blow that relationship through sin. They eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the tree that they were told not to eat from, and that breaks the relationship. And ever since that relationship was broke because of sin, God's had a desire to be back in that relationship. But God can't be back in that relationship because there is sin in the life of his creation. And God cannot physically be in the presence of sin. It just can't happen. It's like light and dark can't be in the same place. It's just an impossibility. And so God's got to take care of the dark. God's got to take care of the sin. He's got to wipe it away. Well, he doesn't want to just snap his fingers, which God could, and take away the sin of the world. God knows that the sin of the world has to be taken away by the ultimate price, the ultimate sacrifice. And if a human person could have done it, they would have done it. But none of us could do it because none of us can keep the law. None of us can be good enough. That process of those generation upon generation of people living under the law were to bring us to a place where we knew we needed Jesus. Bring us to that place where we knew we couldn't do it on our own. Thus, we would turn to God and say, God, I can't do this on my own. I need your help. And then God would say, here's Jesus. Well, not everybody picked that up. Not everybody got that, because by the time Jesus shows up, there is such a strong movement towards, if we just keep the law better, if we just keep the law better, if we just keep the law, if we just keep the law, we'll be fine. So focused on keeping the law that they forgot to keep their eyes open for the Messiah. They forgot to keep their eyes open for the one who is coming to pay the price, so that we can be back in that Garden of Eden relationship. And so we have God out there. Then we have God among us, God with us, Emmanuel, with Jesus. And then after Jesus' resurrection and his ascension into heaven, we have Pentecost. And at Pentecost, we have the Holy Spirit that dwells in us, and that's God in us. So we go from God to God with us to God in us. And so this is what Paul is saying. Paul is trying to get the Roman church to understand this transition that they've gone through, especially the Jewish believers, because for all their lives, for all their fathers' lives and their fathers' fathers' lives, they have lived with God out there. They hadn't accepted the God with us, and they definitely hadn't accepted the God in us. And so they're dealing with the God out there. And so if it's God out there, then the only way to have a good relationship or a right relationship with that God is to follow all the rules. Well, we can't follow all the rules, so we got to go another way. We have to do something different. And so true circumcision is about the heart. It's not about the physical body. It's about who we are. It's about our identity. And his message in this passage to the Jewish Christians, his message in this passage to the Gentile Christians, his message in this passage to you and to me is to don't settle for religion. Seek God. And that's the thing that is so important. That's an overarching message for all of us, whether we're Jewish or Gentile, is that our goal, what we seek after, what we seek to grasp, to hold on to, is not a religion. It's a relationship. And that's the thing that Paul needs to bring the church to, so that he can build upon that foundation. Because right now you've got so many people shooting off in different directions in the church in Rome, because it's all about religion. It's all about keeping the law for the Jewish Christians. And the Gentile Christians, we haven't even brought that conversation in, but they could be dealing with all their background in the Greco-Roman tradition, with all of the Greek gods. And so maybe they're bringing some of that into it. And so it's important for them to hear this message too. And that is that you and I can't settle for a religion. Religion's good. It's just not good enough. Religion is a means to an end. It is a way for us to celebrate. It's a way for us to sacrifice. It's a way for us to praise. It's a way for us to learn and to grow into a right relationship with God. And so his message overarching in these verses, coming here to verse 29, is don't settle for religion. Seek God. And that's a great message for the church in Rome, and that's a great message for you and for me. Because how many times do we do this? We seek a religion. If I can only find the right church, if I can only find the church that appeals to me, if I can only find the worship service that speaks to me. Well, that's you focusing on the wrong things. You need to be focusing on God. And once you start to focus on God, then the style of the worship's not going to be as important. Once you start focusing on God, then you're not going to be as nitpicky about the stuff that maybe you've been nitpicking religion about for a very long time, because it's about the bigger relationship. And the religion becomes merely a means to an end. It becomes a vehicle. And some of us like to drive pickup trucks, and some of us like to drive convertibles. But all those convertibles and pickup trucks alike, and everything in between, get us from point A to point B. And that's what religion's purpose is to help us as we journey, is to help us as we learn and we grow in that relationship. But it's the relationship that is important. So please, Paul is saying to us, we need to say to each other, we need to say to ourselves, don't settle for religion. Seek God. Well, that's where we're going to end up today in verse 29. We're going to pick up in chapter 3 next week. We're making it into the next chapter in the book of Romans. And Paul, again, is laying this foundation so that we can learn and grow. We can learn some of the heavy topics that he's going to be dealing with in this letter. But the first thing that we have to do is we all have to get on that common ground. And that common ground is that none of us are good enough to save ourselves. So until next week, when we get together again, please let somebody know about this Bible study. If it's been a blessing for you, share it with them so that it can be a blessing to them. And until we get together again, I pray that you stay safe and that you stay sane.